atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Oklahoma Christian University political scientist, the laughing libertarian, Trey Orndorff.
I like that intro. I love it. I am the laughing libertarian.
I thought you'd like. I'm a big fan of alliteration, and that seemed to fit. So I thought, well, I'm just going to go with it. What the heck? So it is.
I'll take it.
It's great to be doing the show with you, Trey. We don't often get a chance to do this, and I am looking forward to it. We have, as usual, so many things to cover. We want to get into those new tariffs, the presidential debates that now are apparently on, big Supreme Court decision about Louisiana congressional maps, money to Israel. There's just a ton of stuff, and we should just get right into it. But before we do, there is a podcast, another podcast I would like to tell everyone about called Let's Find Common Ground. It's a bi-weekly show. They explore constructive ways to try to respect various kinds of people who often look at the world in extremely different ways. And they have conversations with members of Congress, journalists, authors, all sorts of interesting people who I think offer pretty valuable perspectives on not only what divides us, but how we can start to bridge those divides. And definitely worth checking out. And I should also mention that in the latest episode of my other podcast, Sustainable Planet, my spouse and political scientist, Kimberly Weir, and I, we take a look at the not very sustainable fashion industry. We get into fast fashion, ultra fast fashion, which is, as you could probably guess, even faster than fast fashion, the crazy global supply chain for fashion, and this weird day Kimberly and I had at the mall. It was still very disturbing. Anyway, a lot of stuff. Hope you'll check it out, and you can find Sustainable Planet and Let's Find Common Ground, well, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll also put links to each of those in today's show notes. All right. So with that, I want to get to our first story today. President Biden this week announced new tariffs on a number of Chinese products, including electric vehicles, batteries, solar cells, metals, and medical equipment. And these increased rates are significant. They include 25% more on steel, aluminum, solar cells, ship-to-shore cranes, and semiconductors, 75% increase on EV tariffs from 25 to 100%. And these tariffs affect roughly $18 billion of imports from China, according to the White House announcement. And they say that these increases are intended to protect American workers, protect American companies from what they characterize as China's unfair trade practices, things like government subsidies, forced technology transfers, and intellectual property theft. In announcing the tariffs, President Biden said China heavily subsidized all these products, pushing Chinese companies to produce far more than the rest of the world can absorb, and then dumping the excess products on the markets at unfairly low prices. When you make tactics like these, it's not competing, it's cheating. Now, not surprisingly, the Chinese government doesn't see things that way. A spokesperson for China's Ministry of Commerce said the U.S. should immediately correct its wrongdoings and revoke the tariff measures against China. China will take resolute measures to defend its own interests. And China's position basically is that the tariffs violate WTO guidelines, and that's actually a concern that the European Union seems to share, because there are some reports saying that the EU won't issue similar tariffs to the U.S. out of concern for WTO rules. So, Trey, what do you think about these tariff increases?
Well, I don't think it's surprising. As a matter of fact, I mean, it's been just a couple of months ago now. We had Scotch Poll and her co-author on the show talking about how Biden has been really kind of losing out in labor unions in a way that you really didn't think of. And I see this as being a complete labor union pander to move forward. I mean, one of the ones you cover that really well. But, one of the ones that really is fascinating is the 200% car tax, even if it's a Chinese vehicle that's being manufactured in Mexico, right? So, and that's part of the reason why we might have some of these WTO issues. And so for listeners who don't recognize this, right, the World Trade Organization is a series of rounds that basically require us to not unilaterally impose huge tariffs on other countries. And so for me, really, in all honesty, one of the things I had problems with President Trump was he came in the aftermath of opening from Obama before him, and he closed things. And this is just following that same pattern. Trump was going after labor union guys, and Biden is trying to outflank Trump. It's not particularly good policy, especially in light of inflationary pressures that we have. And I do think we have to look at this in light of, is it consistent with WTO policy?
Yeah, I should point out that the additional tariffs are, I mentioned 18 billion, and that's not really all that much when you consider that U.S. imports for China were at around 427 billion last year. So we're talking slightly over 4%. And that's much smaller than those Trump tariffs you mentioned, which were over 300 billion. Now, Biden kept those and just added on to that sort of thing. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that there was bipartisan support for this, though there are some Republicans who say, well, the administration took too long to come out with these tariffs and they should cover a lot more. And I got to say, Trey, that made me wonder, didn't there used to be a free trade wing of the Republican Party, and now it's like a tiny little feather, I guess, hanging on there, falling off the bird?
Listen, I mean, I feel like this is a broken record that we have all the time, Mike. Like, where do I live in the Republican Party? And I don't know, right? No, I think this is a place where the idea of free trade in the post-Trump era, Republicans went back to that traditional tariff position. I mean, that was the reason for renegotiating NAFTA. That was the reason that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were on the exact same page when it came to trade. And so, I mean, again, it's not surprising in the sense that I think the world has moved away in some meaningful ways from trade. We now view that in a negative way. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Biden said is that he's targeting these particular locations, quote, because otherwise the subsidies will go to waste, end quote. And that, again, as a free market guy, well, of course, I mean, your subsidies are going to go to waste anyway. And so what we're doing now is we are trying to attempt to now have subsidies on being protected by additional tariffs. It's just terrible policy, absolutely terrible policy. And again, if you take a look at the empirical data, I mean, Scotch Bowl is not particularly on the right spectrum of things, very to the left. But these kinds of policies, they don't generally work.
And their policies,
that's the empirical reality.
I mean, Joe Biden of 2019 meant when he was commenting on Trump's China tariffs, much bigger, right? He said they're short-sighted. He said, and all that they've done is basically hurt American farmers, manufacturers, consumers, and just because, of course, the raising in prices. Now, we talked about this, I think, May and I, a while back when Donald Trump gave that big interview to Time magazine. He said he didn't think that if there was some big tariff on foreign goods that manufacturers would pass that along to customers. And I thought, what world are you living in? But I should point out that if you look at the effect of this additional 18 billion in tariffs, that honestly, that's not going to matter. That's like 0.07% of the economy. And so the White House is right in saying that these particular tariffs aren't going to hurt consumers all that much. But you add, and what you're saying, you add that onto the 300 billion. And I
think there are two that will. And I think the Biden administration knows it. I think the one is the semiconductors moving to 50%. And I think the other is the solar cells moving to 50%. And you'll notice that those two in particular are the longest out. In other words, those two don't go into effect until after the election in 2026. And I think that is in large part because I think those two, so I don't think you're wrong in general, but I think semiconductors and I think solar cells, those two particular ones will be felt by consumers. And I think that's the reason they are the furthest out.
Yeah, I think you're wrong about that. And the reason I think you're wrong is that the White House, the administration put those further out because they are working to decouple, at least in part, supply chains from China to the extent that they can, especially for strategically important things, as well as to build up domestic capacity. And so putting those further out makes sense. And maybe in the short term, yeah, there's a little bit of a bump in that. But my feeling on this is that for a long time, China has gotten away with a lot. For instance, in 2020, Donald Trump announced a big trade deal with China. China said they would buy $200 billion in additional U.S. exports before the end of 2021. What did they end up buying? Extra zero, actually. And so if China won't honor their agreements, if China is rampant in intellectual property theft, if China forces that companies give up their intellectual property, have access to their market, we're not talking about free trade anymore. We're talking about China gets what they want and we don't get anything. And so in this case, I think the world needs to come together and tell China, hey, the free ride is over and we're willing to take a little short-term pain. If you want to play by the rules, if you want to be part of the international system, then you need to play by the rules of the international system. And China is not. And on this, I agree with Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Well, two different things. So one, I don't disagree that especially in IP that we don't need to have issues with China. But I would suggest that that is precisely why we do WTO rounds. And this was one of the problems with not doing it through that enforcement mechanism. But two, to your point about, changing and rejiggering the supply chain, I think that absolutely is the goal. But it is an absolute pipe dream to think that we're going to be manufacturing semiconductors in the United States. Look no further than the example of the Apple semiconductor supply chain, who has been trying before these tariffs to remove themselves from China. And where is the next second biggest? Well, originally the goal was to do that right here in the United States. That did not work out. And instead, their second biggest production of this is from India. So, yeah, will this rejigger where things are going? Undoubtedly. But the language and the idea that suddenly, because we have a 50% tariff on solar cells, semiconductors, some of these parts, that we're suddenly going to have that kind of manufacturing in the United States ignores the fact that we've already seen countries or large companies try to do this before, and where they're landing primarily is in India. So again, that might not be the worst thing given your overall assessment there, but I do think it's disingenuous for the administration to be kind of like leaning in this to the labor union and going, yeah, see, we're going to have more union jobs. No, you're not. India is going to get some more. Yeah, but you might make as you're arguing, you might make a political statement against China, but you're certainly not going to suddenly ramp up semiconductor production in the United States.
Sure. The United States is not going to be anytime soon the world leader in semiconductor production or high-tech semiconductor production or anything like that. Yeah. But I think it's pretty clear that the administration wants to make sure that in the transition to a greener economy, that U.S. industries aren't left behind because of massive government subsidies by China and unfair trade practice and international property theft. And so there's this balance between concern for climate change, certainly, but also making sure that the key technologies in that future are not controlled by a non-democratic, strategic adversary. And I think that's a pretty important concern.
Now, when you say that, are you talking about the actual design specifications to make green energy products, or are you talking about the production of the materials of green energy, these things? I wasn't sure what you meant there, Mike.
Well, for the most part, I think it's more the production, because these things are obviously very expensive to bring online and get going and so forth. And China, I think, is much more into basically appropriating or adapting, or in some cases just stealing designs from other places and manufacturing them at a lower cost. And so, but there are concerns both ways, certainly. But in general, China is not playing by the rules, and some people might actually say, well, hey, let's take a look at what Donald Trump did. Here's one way to spin this. I'm not saying I agree with it, but here's one way to spin this. 2017, the year before Trump's tariffs came into effect, right, over $300 billion. U.S. exports to China were $130 billion compared to a little over $500 billion in imports. That, if you do the math, that's a trade deficit of $375 billion. 2023, last year, exports were just under $148 billion compared to $427 billion in imports. That trade deficit much lower, $279 billion. So some people could look at that and say, well, hey, maybe China's getting the message, at least in part, and maybe playing hardball with them the way that Donald Trump wants to do is the answer. I don't think that is the answer, at least not to the extreme version that he's talking about it. But I certainly do think that we can't just let China do whatever the heck it wants.
So then why be halved about it?
What do you mean?
So, I mean, if it is in fact the case that we want to prevent China from dumping and we don't want to go through traditional WTO protocols, what distinguishes? Why not just have the harder Trumpian caps?
Well, I think we already have that because Biden could have ruled that back in part or in full and chose not to do that. So in a way, it's not that Biden is imposing just a paltry 18 billion. He's keeping a massive 300 billion plus and adding on another 18 billion. And so I think it's important to be strategic because I don't think there is a good justification for just saying, well, we're just going to slap 100% tariff on everything until you start playing fair. I mean, it's in the industries that we feel that they aren't playing particularly fair and also doing it in a way to understand that, well, yeah, if we do too much too quickly, that is going to have potentially inflationary effects. And that would potentially be a regressive tax, right? And so we don't want that. And there's a lot of things to be balanced here. The one thing I would say, though, doesn't really come into it as much is Joe Biden is not going to be able to out-tariff Donald Tariff Man Trump, right? And so I think the political argument is actually the weakest one because Biden can say, I'll put, 25% tariffs in. Trump would be happy to say, I'll put 200% tariffs in. I mean, he doesn't care, right? So I don't think that the political benefit's going to be that great necessarily because Donald Trump will outcompete Joe Biden in tariff promises and probably what he delivers too.
So on the political side, though, so let's move away from Biden and Trump for a second and say, okay, this is the policy. I mean, this seems like the answer really is to say that why did we and why do we continue as the international community to allow China to be part of the WTO and get those most favored trade statuses with all the other countries? So it seems to me that instead of trying to do this pick and go on tariffs, that the fundamental problem once again, and maybe this is maybe I'm too much of an international liberal on this one.
Yeah.
Maybe you're being the realist, is to basically say, well, shouldn't we pressure them in the WTO or knock them out of the WTO as opposed to the picking with tariffs, which again, historically speaking, has not led to the kinds of either behavioral changes that we've hoped for, right? Pre-WTO era, it wasn't as if, during the height of the 1920s and 30s, when Republicans were once again the tariffs and that wasn't as if we somehow made major policy changes for other countries in vis-a-vis our tariff policy, which is what led to early rounds like Uruguay for the WTO, saying, well, wait a second, let's let certain countries in. Why are we doing this? I mean, again, I hear what you're saying about China, and so I don't disagree on that front. But it seems like it's an international institutional question rather than a tariff question.
Well, in part, of course, the WTO process is extraordinarily slow. And even if you win a WTO case, what do you win? Well, you win the right to impose retaliatory tariffs, basically. And so, I mean, yeah. It becomes when you're...
In other words, you get to revoke their most favored nation status.
Oh, well, that potentially yeah, right, because that would, yeah. So the problem is this can be a years-long process. And if you're a politician dealing in much shorter electoral timelines, that's not necessarily, and there's no guarantee, of course, you're going to win. It's just a lot easier to ignore the WTO as China certainly, I feel like, has done, plenty of times. But I do want to point out that I am not making an argument for Donald Trump's position here, because what he wants is, he's considering supposedly a 10% tariff on all imports anywhere and tariffs on Chinese imports as high as 60%. And that would be extraordinarily significant, right? Because that would be roughly, I think, that'd be 15% of the economy, I think, more or less, is imports. And so you tax that big part of the economy that much, boy, we would feel that. I don't know that he'd actually do that. I hope that that's just campaign rhetoric as opposed to anything that would be an actual policy.
So in short, you want tariffs, but again, if the tariffs aren't high enough to impose significant shifts, why would we then think that China is going to respond to them?
Well, we would.
I hear you,
yeah.
mean, I think, in other words, if American consumers aren't feeling it, it seems unlikely that China will be impacted enough to do what you're hoping will do, which is domestic shifts and changes.
Well, I think you need to pick your spots. And so, you can say something like, well, for this particular industry, if China wants to be competitive and sell to our market, our pretty significant market in this industry, then they're going to have to change their practices in this one area. Maybe there are other areas where we're like, you know what? There's just way too much of a negative impact on consumers. We don't want to have to deal with that. So we're not going to worry about Chinese manufacturing or IP theft in dozens of industries, but we're going to focus on these few strategic, critical industries for our future. And so I think if you pick your spots like that, you can try at least to thread the needle between not affecting American consumers that much, at least especially those on the who are least able to afford it, but also sending a clear message to China on that. Now, it would help, of course, if we had more international support for that. And one thing the Biden administration has tried to do more than the Trump administration is to build more international coalitions on this, though it's been kind of rough going because in the end, consumers like cheap stuff and China's able to pump out cheap stuff. And so that's awfully compelling.
Well, I mean, I think the other element here, I hear what you're saying. You're right. Look, we'll take our lumps on these particular issues. It's kind of it's a traditional, import substitution model. But we're just going to do it on these particular industries. But of course, the two assumptions is that there will ever come a point when you could lower those. But let's put that aside for a second. But what happened after the Trump tariffs? I mean, this is something that we covered on the show repeatedly. Well, China responded with their own retaliatory tariffs. So it seems relatively likely that China will respond with its own retaliatory tariffs on different areas to try to give President Trump some heartburn. So, I hear you that he's attempting to be targeting. However, just historically speaking, when we enter in these kinds of tariff goes, and again, I'm not suggesting that China is they're playing by all the rules kind of thing. Again, I would suggest that we need to think about why we've included them in the WTO. But put that aside for a second, since that is in fact the policy positions that we've made. This oftentimes leads to tariff conflicts and wars. We saw that with Trump, and I think it's likely we'll see it again with Biden. So I hear you, but I just suggest again that the data would be that it will unlikely to just be these few industries, because either China will not feel the effects, i.e. won't have any impact, or if they do think they're going to feel effects, they will likely have retaliatory tariffs towards us the same exact way they did it with Trump. Sure,
but that's an instance where we actually have a pretty big advantage because they're exporting a lot more to us than we are to them. And so if we go tit for tat in tariffs, their economy is much more export driven. It's much more fragile in a lot of ways than ours is. And so we can, I would argue, withstand, our economy is also bigger. We can withstand that more than they can, especially if we can get some international support for this. I mean, it would have been nice if 10, 15, 20 years ago, we had pushed this on China, but we were working under a set of assumptions that turned out to be partially or fully erroneous about opening trade and opening, political systems and all that. But when are we going to do this?
Because I agree with you on that. I think one of the things that in the political economic literature that we got wrong was that having open markets would lead to democratic systems. And I think that is one of those things that we now have to recognize is not true. I absolutely agree with you on that front.
Well, maybe on that note of agreement, we should quit and move on to our next thing.
Let's make it domestic. And I mean, we're already talking about Biden and Trump having all kinds of issues, and they're going to duke it out in a whole new way. So if you want the understatement of the weeks, it was Access calling the presidential debate changes, quote, a whirlwind. Yeah. Because what we're going to have happen is effectively it's the end of the Commission on Presidential Debates. For those of you who haven't kept up this week, this organization, it dates back to 1987. And it was from both of the party organizations, Democrats and Republicans, to facilitate debates. I can talk. Biden has wanted to change that for some time. His primary call was the debates occurred too late. Now, the commission has even put out items indicating this is untrue, and it is. He argues that it's after voting's already started, and that's not exactly true. But what he is trying to get at is he wants it long before that. And let's be honest, not in front of a live audience. After Biden said that he wouldn't take part in any commission on presidential debates, Trump's unquestionably accepted that, and in kind of another presidential first on Truth Social. And so this has led to a debate in June and September with some caveats. We're going to have no studio audience. We're going to have no mics when it's not your turn. And we're going to be seeing the first of these. That June one is going to be on CNN. And it's all going to happen in another national first before we've had a national convention from either the DNC or the RNC. So this is some really highly unusual shifts to presidential communications. This is my area. I love this. And the Trump campaign then came back out and has proposed some extra debates in July and August, which has now led to an accepting of an ABC News invite for September 10. And although we're not positive about this, at least as of Friday morning, there could be another one on Fox News on October 2nd. So a lot of the major pieces here, Mike, are right. Again, no audience. Another huge one, and I think both candidates wanted this, they don't want to have a third party. They don't want RFK Jr. on there. I mean, I get that he's crazy, but he would have met the requirement to get in for the Commission on Presidential Debates, but there's not going to be a third party. And then, of course, the idea that we're going to be a little bit more gentlemanly, maybe, and have muted mics. So my early take is, I think the thing that's most worthy of an investigation here, I'm curious about your thoughts on this, is why go so early? And my answer is I think Biden is pushed early because I think his team is a little bit worried about all of the polling data. I know we're still early in the race. I'm not trying to make heavy predictions here. I would suggest that Biden pushed for this like this because he sees this as a chance for him to win. I'm not sure why else you do it. Thoughts?
Yeah, I wondered about that early day too, because June 27th is just crazy early. I mean, in 2020, the first one was September 29th. For 2016, it was September 26th. And that makes sense because that's about when normal Americans, start actually paying attention, right? And also after they're actually
early vote.
Yeah. And also it's after the nominees have been formally selected. So my thinking on the earliness of this is sort of along the lines of yours, is that I think Biden does want, I don't think it's because he expects to get necessarily a bump from this early debate, because anything you would get from this early debate this far before I don't think, have any kind of staying power. My take is that this early debate is a test run. If Biden comes out there and just does disastrously bad, well, it's far enough before the election that he can just make up some pretense to say why he's not debating again. Oh, Donald Trump didn't follow the rules, because Donald Trump's not going to follow the rules. He'll find a way to evade the rules, right? So I don't think I think it's just a test run. You think, well, it's a low cost thing. And if he does really well, then we'll go with the next one. But otherwise, we won't. Because honestly, do you actually think, Trey, that a debate on June 27th is going to move the needle and keep it moved?
I can't imagine it will, given historical evidence that anything happening in June like this. And because we already know, so one of the things that listeners you think about, right? Who's paying attention to debates? You've already got a teeny portion of the American electorate so the electorate itself who's paying attention to debate. And then the further and further out you get, the less likely it is that you have individuals paying attention to these things. So even if it could have a long-term impact, so let's assume that somehow Mike, we're both wrong, and maybe it could have a big impact. But the question is who would it be? How many people could it even potentially be impacting? Is just going to be a sliver. So even if we were wrong, and I don't know, it impacted 12.5% of the people who watch it or pay attention to it. That's nobody, that early in an election cycle.
Yeah, especially because the people who are most likely to see that and feel something about that are not going to be those moderately attentive swing voter types. They're going to be, this is mostly going to be the sort of hardcore partisan political junkie folks who already know, for the most part, who they're going to vote for.
Well, I mean, and think back when we think about election access, and we want to think about having more or less election access. One of the biggest things that states do to try to change that is to push back how far you need to register. And what we know definitively as political scientists, right? You push that back 30 days, you push it back 60 days, or in some states, in other words, you just push it back 2 months, and the number of people who vote is going to be substantially different. So think about that, right? If you're a listener, that means, right, if you push back when you have to register to vote from the election 60 days, you're losing a ton of people. That's just to register. So now imagine you have a debate that is what? More than 60 days beyond that, right? Am I doing my math there right? Yeah.
So yeah, again, debates, I'll be interested in watching it. Of course, I'll watch it with the same sort of perverse, I don't know, feel of like, oh my God, what is this dumpster fire going to be like? Because I assume it's going to be that way. I can't imagine it being anything else, but I don't expect any substance because we don't get substance in presidential debates and haven't for a long, long time. And I guess I'm curious to see how unhinged Donald Trump's going to sound and how with it Joe Biden's going to sound. And I think most people feel that way.
And you say that, and you're not wrong. We don't get big debates. And I think sometimes we lay that blame on the candidates. But I just want to point out the reason that we have the kinds of debates that we have is because we have the kinds of voters that we have. And I'm just going to lay that out there. And I think that is a problem with us. So what's your thought? The last little bit here is, I mean, again, RFK is a nut. We all know he's a nut. But the fact that both of them don't want to have him on the mic, do you think that's because both of them are pretty concerned that he ends up hurting them in some ways? I mean, that's something that Ken and I have chatted about. Who does he hurt more? Or do you think this is just nothing to do with that and it's just a way to kind of just not even worry about it?
I think you're right with the former thing, is that it's not entirely clear who he's going to hurt more, and it's just easier to make it a clean sort of thing and get him out of the picture entirely. So that would be my take. And now, for a while, at least there was talk about opening it up to anyone who was at 15% or more in 4 polls and was on enough state ballots to potentially win an electoral college majority. I don't think that RFK Jr. meets those requirements at that point anyway, but I don't really see what the point of him being on the stage would be, except maybe to make both Trump and Biden look sane by comparison. I don't know, really. There is a hardcore minority of individuals who are just RFK Jr. lovers, and it's a weird amalgamation. But other thoughts on the debate? No, that I think, like I said, like a lot of folks, I will be watching and kind of cringe watching. I guess probably will be how I will be watching.
Maybe we should live stream this or something. I was suggesting this on Discord. We live stream it, and then we have some kind of game like, Mike takes 0.05 milligrams of THC every time.
Oh my God! Yeah,
too cringy.
Someone get Mike off the ground after the first half an hour or something like that. Oh, well, we'll figure that out anyway. Well, let's move on to something different. Supreme Court story. They're allowing Louisiana's new congressional map to go ahead. And we talked about this story a couple weeks ago when it was at the lower court level. It basically was a brief unsigned order. The court stayed that lower court's injunction that barred Louisiana from using the new map. And this is not a decision on the merits. In its order, the court cited what they call the Purcell principle, which is that courts shouldn't change election rules right before elections, because if you do that, you can confuse voters and you can create problems for election administration. Now, the 3 liberals on the court would have denied the stay, and Justice Jackson, in fact, actually wrote a dissent about that. And her argument was essentially that there's no reason why Louisiana can't put together a new map by June 4th. That's the date set by the lower court. And she rejected Louisiana's argument that, well, no, May 15th is a hard deadline. She said, well, there's no risk of voter confusion here, or not much, because we're pretty far out from November. And so in the past, in fact, we've actually ruled on election changes that were much closer to this. And so she concluded on a note of what sounds like judicial restraint to me, saying Rather than waiting in now, I would have let the district court's remedial process run its course before considering whether our emergency intervention was warranted. So, Trey, what do you think about this decision?
Well, just for a little bit of extra context, I mean, it's a little unique what we have here, right? So you have House Bill 1 that created a new congressional map in Louisiana. And what it did was it created a single Black district in Louisiana. And that gets challenged by Black voters and a number of interest groups. And that's what then leads to Senate Bill 8, which has these 2 Black districts. And that's the one that is now being challenged, this time by white voters. And this is the one that had put a stay on what was going on. So there's a lot of racial complications going on here. In all honesty, I feel, this is a difficult position to be in if you're the legislature in Louisiana, right? So you come out with one particular map, and it probably did have some racial issues. So you had one Black district, and it did not really represent the total amount of Black population in Louisiana. And you get an advisory, you get an opinion that says you're probably in violation of the Voting Rights Act. So you go, okay, we need to work on this, and you work on it, and you come back up, and you got 2 Black districts. You say, okay, I think this is going to pass the Voting Rights Act. But now you have the court going, I don't know if you did that right. I think you've racially gerrymandered. I mean, what are you supposed to do? I mean, in a sense, you've got to account for race to be in compliance. And I think it's a good thing with the Voting Rights Act. So you can't both ignore race, because otherwise then you're going to end up with the Voting Rights Act issue, or you've got to account for race. And then the court's going to tell you you can't do it because you considered race in the creation of your districts. I don't know. I feel bad for I feel bad for the legislature. It's a difficult position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of legislatures are sort of in this position ever since the Supreme Court's decision removed the so-called pre-clearance requirement, where states couldn't just sort of change districts however they wanted to because of those states with a history of racial segregation and issues with race, right? And so, I mean, we saw a similar issue with the map, and I want to say Alabama, it was, I think, a few years ago. Yes. But you're right. There's this tension between the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause, and it isn't an easy thing to do, but I think Justice Jackson had a point saying that, well, why are we getting involved now? Why don't we let them work it out? November's a ways off. On the other hand, in her dissent, she mentioned that voters wouldn't be confused, and I agree. Though it might actually make election administration a little more difficult because you push off one deadline and everything else kind of falls behind. But honestly, there's not a big difference between May 15th and June 4th, right? Like 14 business days. So I think the court jumped in here a little bit prematurely, and they should have let the process play out a little bit longer. But clearly the majority disagrees with me on this.
I hear that, and I think one of the problems, though, is one of the reasons you might want to allow, and I'm not even sure, I'm thinking about this out loud, is one of the reasons you might not want to have restraint in this particular case is something has to move forward, and if ultimately we need to have another Supreme Court ruling that balances these two items. What are you supposed to do in the meantime? In other words, so if both Senate Bill 8 and House Bill 1 are in different ways unconstitutional, and you take a look, and if you take a look at the actual map, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what option 3 is. Does that make sense? Right? If there was an obvious option 3, okay, then let it play out. But I'm not even sure theoretically what option 3 is, because you're not going to get to 3 Black districts, and if you did, you would definitely be violating the Equal Protection Clause. You can't go back down to 1. You've already been told that. So what else does that make sense? Like, so in this case, I hear the restraint, and I'm on board with that, generally speaking. But I think to myself, but what were they supposed to do? I don't know.
No,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it is difficult. And what made it even more difficult for Louisiana is their top priority, or one of their top priorities, was making sure that they put Mike Johnson and Steve Scalise in districts that are as safe as possible, right? And that,
Well, I mean, obviously, we got the gerrymandering going on too. True. Continue.
Yeah. And so the whole the whole process just makes me want to vomit, just generally speaking, because it goes so against what congressional districts are supposed to be. They're supposed to be these geographically compact and sane and sensible groupings that represent real communities of interest. And they're not that in so many instances because state legislatures do what state legislatures do. And I mean, I get why they do it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't make me want to vomit.
So I'll be honest, this is one of those areas where I think, Mike, our Constitution is probably at some of its most deeply flawed. And that was the idea that states and state legislatures create national districts. And because the idea that we would have nonpartisan districts, well, it was as erroneous in its thinking as the idea that our president and vice president could be the first and the runner-up.
Right.
I think this is just one of those areas where we're still dealing with the ramifications. I mean, I love our system in many ways, but this is an area that is terrible.
Although I got to say, the image of Donald Trump as Joe Biden's vice president is just sort of, that would be interesting, wouldn't it now? So
that would be maybe one of the only times I would actually maybe try to get a job. I mean, wouldn't it be, I would love to be in the White House for that. That would be worth a job there, just to be up close and personal.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. I said, hey, we can, if we could always go back to multi-member district, Congress would just have to change the law they passed way back in the day, and this would take care of all those problems. But
that's one of the books I just reviewed. I actually thought that was not one of the worst suggestions. I was impressed with that. So yeah, you should, if you want to listen a little bit more about that. That was Newman, I believe, that we did just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, somehow I don't think that will ever quite catch on, but at least for now, it looks like we now know what Louisiana's districts are going to look like. So yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I guess this brings us then to another international item, Mike. That is Israel aid, and this is huge because on Tuesday, the Biden administration at least informally informed congressional committees that it was moving forward with $1 billion in weapons deals for Israel, even though it had earlier paused a shipment of bombs. Now, I think in part of this was a lot of maybe wishful thinking on the part of some on the left that this was a harder track that Biden was going to take. Anonymous sources say that 700 million of this is headed to tank ammunition, 500 million is in tactical vehicles, and 60 million is in mortar rounds. And if that is in fact true, which it sounds like it is, this is a pretty stinging rebuke to the pro-Palestinian wing of the Democratic Party. But it also undercuts Republicans who clearly were kind of falsely arguing that Biden had stopped supporting Israel, or in the words of Senator Tom Cotton, amounted to a, quote, arms embargo, end quote. And so, again, this comes in the wake of the Biden administration in the past several weeks really trying to stop Israel from taking significant action on Ramah, which, at least as of Friday morning, Israel is not invading, but is attacking from a distance, but again, not advancing. Israel's arguing that there are 4 Hamas battalions in that city. And given that we now have reports of anti-tank attacks happening as early as this morning, that is probably true. But the humanitarian question, of course, is where now could a Palestinian even flee? Options are very, very limited. Right now, aid through our temporary floating pier just really began this morning at 2 a.m. So that's Friday at 2 a.m. just started happening. But some of those shipments, early reports are saying, are already being kind of grabbed and snatched by Hamas, which is a traditional issue that has been going on for aid. So Biden administration officials are trying to get Netanyahu to wind the war down. That doesn't seem to be likely at this juncture. It's something that Ken and I have talked about a lot, Mike. So I'm really curious what you think about this. This is something we've talked about in the Discord channel, but not something we've obviously had a chance to chat about live. Yeah, I think certainly the Biden administration has been very supportive of Israel, but it hasn't just essentially given Israel everything it wanted. And I mean, to me, this idea, and it seems some people are pushing this, that, well, they are our allies, so therefore we should give them whatever they want, whenever they want, and just shut up about it. And to me, that's a kind of a bizarre argument, right? Okay, Netanyahu says we're not a vassal state of the United States. And sure, of course they're not. But if someone's giving you tens of billions of dollars in stuff, then they have a right to attach some strings to how that's used. And I don't think it's unreasonable to pause, not even stop, but just to pause shipments of things that we feel will be used in a way that is not consistent with what we believe our values to be.
So what do you think about the fact, I mean, again, it seems pretty likely that the anonymous sources, I mean, we're being reported by multiple major news outlets, the idea of the tank ammunition and the mortar rounds is the bulk of this. And that is precisely the kind of thing that does come at a potential human cost. So what's your feeling on that?
Well, I mean, anything's we could give them slingshots and they could take someone's eye out with it. I mean, there's always going to be we're sending them weapons, and we're not sending them weapons to mount on their wall and look pretty or make them look tough. We're sending them so they can kill people. And so, but the question is, I
guess what I'm saying though is like mortar rounds, for example. One of the reasons that some of the shipments were paused earlier, mortar rounds are more indiscriminate. So I get it, right? Like, but if you're shipping like we were to the Ukraine early on, you're shipping, say, ammunition for rifles. That's a fundamentally different kind of calculus for our human cost when you're talking about civilians than when you are bombing into urban centers. I guess that's what I was trying to get at there. So obviously we're trying to kill people. I get that. I'm not trying to, but.
Yeah. And we're basically okay with Israel trying to kill Hamas people. And I'm on board with that. I think there's plenty of Hamas people that need killing, but we're not on board with dropping 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated urban areas. And I'm on board with that too. And, it made me think about something last week's show, Jay and Justin. And Jay basically said, I'm going to misquote him, paraphrase him, whatever, that Hamas essentially brought this onto people in Rafah by essentially enmeshing themselves, right, with the civilian population, setting themselves up in their midst. And of course, that's right. That's why they did it. But then I thought, well, okay, let's say, for instance, someone is, caught robbing a bank and they use a customer as a human shield. Would I be okay with saying, well, yeah, just, shoot the hostage to get to the bad guy? No, of course I wouldn't. Right. And in this instance, it's more than that, because presumably for every serious bad guy, awful Hamas terrorist person Israel gets, they're going to end up hurting a lot more non-Hamas, non-combatant people in Israel. And so given that that's the case, I don't think it's unreasonable at all for us to say, even to go further and say, listen, until we feel like our aid is being used in a way that's consistent with our values, we're not going to give you any more of our aid, and figure it out yourselves, and it reminded me too of something that John McCain said. Trey, John McCain's sort of one of my very few modern day political heroes. And this was after that torture report came out back, 15, 20 years ago, whatever. And, and he said, hey, this is something that compromises that most distinguishes us from our enemies. And that to me is important. Hamas may not care about the lives of the people of Gaza. I don't think they do, but we should. And I don't think we should be in the business of helping anyone who thinks that, tens of thousands of civilian casualties, a mass refugee crisis, and a famine is, well, just business as usual, ho-hum. And yeah, it was an awful attack. I mean, over 1,000 Israelis were killed, hundreds were taken hostage, and that's horrific and awful. But that doesn't mean that anything goes in to destroy every last Hamas person. And we don't care if we have to kill 16,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 Gazans if we can eliminate Hamas. I think that logic is fundamentally immoral.
Look, actually, I've thought about this a lot. We've talked about this a lot in non-live ways. And I wonder, one of the problems with this question is you have a ton of Palestinian people who are effectively trapped in location. And one of the things that Ken and I had talked about was the fact that they do, in fact, live effectively in an open air prison. And as a result of the fact that we just won't let people freely move, many of these people would have long ago left if we would have let them. But the countries that surround them won't allow them to leave. And that includes Egypt. and other countries won't take them in because we kind of have pretty negative thoughts about immigration, I think, more globally any more than we ever have maybe in the past 20 years. And for me, I guess one of the realizations that I've had is I think this might be an example of why the free movement of people is so important for human rights. Because if we could have moved, if people could have been allowed to move in ways that they would have wanted to, we wouldn't have the same kinds of issues in this location that we do right now. I don't mean that as a dodge, but I recognize that's not a popular position. I mean, the idea that people can freely move among states, I think, is more appalling to more people right now than it's ever been. But I can't help but look at this. And I'll be honest, I think that you've helped me think more carefully about this. I am pro-Israel on this one. I haven't always been on everything. I'm very loyal, but I do think that I wasn't as thoughtful on the human calculus for those Palestinians as I ought to have been, ethically speaking. And I think the only response to that I have seen, as I've thought about that more carefully, is to allow those people to move. Now, I'm not arguing at gunpoint, right? So be careful here. I'm arguing free people in peace times, the ability to exit these locations.
Yeah, and I think you're right that even in countries that are relatively well off and stable, we see issues with accepting, with free movement of people across borders. And when you're saying, a country like Egypt, which has, God knows, enough of its own problems, right? And you can understand why they would say, well, we don't want to have to deal with this inflow of bunch of poor people.
To let them move through, maybe. Like, in other words, you could say you can't stay here because they move through.
Yeah,
right?
well, yeah. And of course, then who's going to police that, right? If they don't move through or not. And so a lot of these countries are struggling for various reasons on their own. And the idea that they can just accept a bunch of refugees, that's difficult, right? And so, but you're right. I agree that that's a huge part of the problem. It's just not something that I certainly don't have a good solution to it. And for me, it's not so much being, I'm certainly not pro-Hamas. I'm very anti-Hamas. But what I try to be in this is pro-human rights. And to me, the first question I want to ask is what is most in line with that viewpoint? And it certainly is Israel going after the people who did the atrocities on October 7th, but doing so in a way that is, I think, as humane as possible in the circumstances. And I think Israel's not doing as good of a job of that as they could be doing. And we shouldn't assist them in, like I said, in actions that we believe are ethically, morally questionable. And I think there are some.
Now, here's my last question. I've thought about this a lot. I'm curious of your take. So even let's assume that Netanyahu today said, you know what, we're done. Fighting is finished. We're not going to attack anymore. I think we have to assume that means that is the end of getting any more hostages back. I think hostages are either dead or they're never coming back at this juncture. That's terrible, but I don't hope that. That would be my prediction at this point. So I think you end your hostilities, you accept that. I guess what I'm trying to ask, Mike, is what is the next step that stops people from, obviously you're no longer actively harming people as a result of conflict, but that is not going to stop a lot of the death that is occurring in this area.
No.
And since you can't go in, since you are right, Hamas is embedded in this. It's not like suddenly we can start sending in troops or sending in people just to do humanitarian things because we know that they will be harmed. What do you do?
Yeah, and there aren't any good answers to this, right? So it's not like I'm saying, well, it's simple. Just stop killing innocent people. That's not that simple. And there are a lot of, you have to weigh what the appropriate use of force is and what an acceptable level of collateral damage is. And I know people are going to say, well, the acceptable level is 0. Well, that's just not a real world, position.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying, because then now you're bringing it to kind of a police action effectively at that point. And I still don't think that you're going to have, death at 0 in a police action location.
Yeah, and so I'm not saying there are any clear answers here. I don't think it's just as simple as, well, Israel just needs to capitulate to Hamas or to free the Palestinians or to stop whatever. It's not that simple on either side, but I certainly know that what's happening now is both sort of offends my moral sensibilities and from a real politics sort of way, I think is just making the situation worse in the long run. And so it's a lose-lose.
So I guess my last question on this is, and let's make it political, on politics and policy here. And Biden putting out this $1 billion in aid, it's not going to win him any friends, it seems like, from Democratic voters. Do you think this has a long impact on him?
I don't think there are very many voters who are going to vote based on Gaza and Israel and so forth. And for those who are, I think that their minds are already pretty much made up, because if I am a progressive left person who is really, one of the protesters, and I think, well, let's see, I'm in a battleground state, maybe, because probably most of them aren't, right? I mean, I'm thinking about where most of these protests happen. But if I have that choice between Joe Biden, who at least seems to be a little inclined to express some concern and frustration with Netanyahu and Israel, or Donald Trump, who basically seems to just be, yeah, let's go. That to me is a simple option, right? So that's why I just don't think politically it's going to matter a whole heck of a lot. All right. Well, on that note, we will close our regular show, but we have so much that we want to talk about that we didn't get a chance to, that we will be talking about on the midweek show. Things like, for instance, my beloved Financial Protection Bureau, my favorite government agency, is in the news with the Supreme Court ruling. We're going to talk about bribery. That's always a fun bribery topic, and stadium subsidies. We're looking forward to getting into all that on the midweek show. So if you are a supporter, you will be getting that full midweek show without any ads. And if you want to be a supporter, well, we hope you will consider doing that. You can always hit us up at patreon.com/politicsguys. There's politicsguys.com/support. And if you're like me, you're like, I can't remember that, just click on one of the links in the show notes. It'll take you right there to all support options. And like I said, you get these ad-free versions of everything we release. If you're a supporter, you get the full-length midweek episode instead of just that 15-minute preview period. You get to be on our Discord group. Trey and I are on there all the time. There's all kinds of interesting conversations. So a bunch of cool stuff. We hope you will consider it. And even if you are not in a position to support the show financially, but you think, I'd really like to hear the full midweek show, not a problem. I'm happy to set that up for you. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you happen to be using. We would really appreciate it if you took just a minute and did that for us. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,